Hey everybody, welcome to the 58th annual IAM annual meeting here. We are so excited to have you all. I hope you all get very active in the comments below as well, because we're going to be talking and interacting with you and taking a live Q&A at the end of this session. So please get very active in there as well. We'd love to hear from you. We have the Asia Pacific corporate client panel here today. I'm extremely excited about this opportunity. This is the first time we've brought preeminent thought leaders from the Asia Pacific region to you. So I'm very excited to hear what's on their mind. We have Kay Koot, CEO of Silk Relo, overseeing offices throughout the Asia continent. We have Karen Mendez, the Global HR Mobility Lead at CSIRO in Melbourne, Australia. We have Lynn Lee, the Head of Global Mobility in the APAC region at Mars in Singapore. And we have Stephen Park with the International Mobility Center, Schneider Electric, based in Hong Kong. Thank you, everybody. How's everybody doing today?
Awesome.
Great.
Good. Hi, Ben.
Yep.
Fantastic. Karen, I'm going to start with you. Can you just kind of set the scene for us there in Australia? What is the state or the status of relocation currently? Could you kind of set the table for us?
Sure. So within Australia, domestic moves from a relocation sense are still to some degree operating as normal. There are some additional boundaries that are a bit harder to cross quite physically and politically. A lot of the state borders within Australia have some heavy restrictions associated with them, particularly Queensland and WA, so Western Australia. But internationally, when we've had people moving back into Australia and certainly moving out of Australia, we've had pretty good response rates and delivery times from our RMCs and our relocation companies. So for all intents and purposes, it's relatively business as usual from an Australian front, and we're seeing very little impact in relation to COVID and the pandemic.
Thanks, Karen. And Stephen, I want to ask you the same question. What is the status currently?
Sure. In my role, which looks after Asia Pacific, it goes from all the way Japan, China, down to Australia, New Zealand, and as far as India. It's quite challenging here in Asia Pacific. A lot of the governments have really clamped down on relocations. It's just traveling into those countries are challenging. What we're finding, Hong Kong, for example, where I'm based, we are getting people in. We're limiting relocations to business critical moves only. And as an organization, we've decided to focus all our relocation activity to business critical moves. What we're finding at the moment is 6 to 8 months into COVID-19, our activity levels haven't actually dropped. They're pretty consistent compared to this time last year. So we're going through quite a lot of change at the moment, and we're just wondering, each relocation is very challenging at this stage, and even with moving shipment of household goods, that's challenging as well. So it's been a tough 6 to 8 months, let's put it that way.
So you mentioned, and I just want to understand this, you mentioned that you're kind of restricted to business critical, but also the volumes have still been very strong. Is that correct?
Correct.
What would you attribute that to? How that's kind of an interesting, it's not what I'm hearing necessarily everywhere else.
Yeah, I think we're bucking the trend as an organization, and what we're noticing is that all of our relocation activity is typically geared at senior executives or at critical moves which relate to development programs. They haven't really been put on pause. And what we're finding is that we are seeing the activity still continue. There was a pause definitely earlier in the year. There were 3 to 6 months, there was definitely a pause, whereas now we're seeing it filter through. We're wondering what next year will bring.
Lynn, I'd like to ask you to also give us kind of an idea of what's going on in your world right now as well.
Yeah, actually, I would like to echo exactly what Stephen has said. So we cover the same region. The number of initiations that we have seen this year versus last year is about the same. However, of course, the number of moves that are actually executed in Asia Pac is different. but that means that the conversations with the business are still ongoing. And in fact, conversations and managing the moves are more complex. Every conversation takes 5 times longer than it normally takes. Because, I think what we're trying to do is creative solutions. From a normal assignment, the businesses are challenging us to think out of the box. Can we look at business travel arrangements? I think what's interesting is, given that we are a US organization with a really big presence in Europe and America, there is a disconnect between the extent of mobility or, physical mobility in the US domestically or in Europe, where borders are more open versus that of Asia. It requires us to educate our stakeholders that the border control situation here in Asia Pacific is very different as compared to countries in the West. So I think that adds to the complexity of the conversations that we're having today. And that's why we still see a high number of conversations that are coming through.
You mentioned some of those difficult conversations, and you've kind of given us a little bit of an idea of some of them, but how receptive are your stakeholders and your transferees to those conversations?
I think it's a very interesting conversation because there is a disconnect between what's happening on the ground in Asia versus the understanding that the businesses have as well as the assignees. So interestingly enough, for the assignees, we're actually discouraging people from traveling in general, because should someone contract COVID-19, whether or not we have the best private medical insurance available, it really doesn't matter, because the situation will be taken out of the company's hands and any medical treatment will be a government-led activity. And I think that's especially concerning in emerging markets like Indonesia, India, Philippines, where the quality of medical care, it's not quite at international standard. And as much as we can counsel and advise our assignees not to travel, I don't think that message has really clicked in their heads in terms of the reality of the situation on the ground. So that's why I say the conversations have been really interesting.
Well, when you said really interesting, I saw Karen and Stephen both nodding their heads like, yes, we know, right? Stephen, what are those conversations like on your end, and how have they been going?
Sure. What we're noticing this year is that the decisions are made around relocating someone. It's much more deliberate. It's not the easy conversation of, oh, would you like to go to Hong Kong or New Zealand, and in 2 or 3 months' time, you and your family will be there. Now the discussions are a lot more about, okay, are you prepared to go? These are the business reasons. We know it's a big ask for you. You're going to be there without your social network, without your family. That's a huge decision to make. So when we do relocate someone, or we get into the conversation about relocating someone, it's a very deliberate business justification-led discussion. And just echoing what Lynn said, it's not easy. People will miss flights. They don't have the right certificate overnight. The documents you need to get onto that plane can change without it being published. Flights get cancelled, hotels get fully booked. So it really is an interesting time to be in mobility.
Really. Now, Kay, your organization speaks to transferees of all over, of all types, and many different organizations. How have those conversations with the transferees been going, and what are some of those things that they're thinking about, and maybe new challenges that they hadn't faced before, and how is that impacting the movement of household goods and people?
I think the greatest challenge is human beings. We like to have consistency, and we like to do things the way we know we've done it in the past. And the conversations, even for our consultants, they're very different at the moment. You know, there's the same sort of information that you're providing, but there's an added level of empathy. There's definitely a lot more time being spent in the preparation for those discussions, even in putting together the emails, because as Stephen had mentioned, you know, rules and regulations or recommendations can change overnight, and it's very fluid and very flexible. And that uncertainty really puts us in the dark place in the back of our head, because we very often go to that dark place when we don't know something or the way it's going to occur, and it becomes more concerning. So the duty of care and the empathy points, also making sure that we have different tools and resources available to them to meet their needs. And there really are no silly questions, you know, and making sure that we're leaning into those conversations, not only with the transferee, but with our client contacts, because very often we are the front line to hearing what's going on in the transferee's life or the family's life, and being that, I'll say, coach as it is to help bring it all together. You know, saying it's unprecedented times is absolutely what it is, and stretching our consultants. And I'm also mindful that our consultants are stressed, especially as they look to deliver extraordinary service. There's a frustration point, but they also very often are in an isolation point because they're working from home, right? So the resources of the team and how we work together is also another challenge.
Have you seen, Kay, this impact the movement of household goods in the region?
Yes, I would say absolutely. And you've got, you know, where it really comes back to, I call it the domino effect, is the visa migration, right? If you can't get people in and you can't get the right documentation in order to be able to get movement of household goods, you've got a very real challenge that's there. And the regulatory environment that they can change of saying, yes, we'll allow this in, or no, we won't. Timing. There's some markets that it hasn't so much. We've also seen in some markets, the exodus, right? And movers love those U shapes, you know, the market goes down, the market goes up, and we want to keep all the U's together, right? Seeing, you know, in Hong Kong in particular, there's a few parallels of you've got COVID, but you also have some uncertainty as it relates to other business environment, political environment. So that some folks choose to move. So we're seeing, I'll say, a stretch on the system of the exit, but it also depends on the business type and the market, right? So it is an interesting time.
Karen, I want to kind of look forward from this, right? And ask you, kind of going forward, thinking maybe strategically, prognosticating a little bit, putting on our, you know, our fortune teller, you know, hat a little bit. How does this impact global mobility, relocation, the demand for it from the organization, the willingness from the employee, in your opinion, in the near term, let's say, or the near to midterm?
Sure. I think, and I think Stephen and Lynn touched on this a little bit, those conversations around with the signees moving are a little bit awkward. I think there'll probably be an increase in reluctancy around moving, as kind of Lynn put it, once the penny kind of drops around the gravity of the situation. And certainly the media either helps or it doesn't help with that situation, depending on the story at hand. So I think from the assignee's point of view, those conversations will be a lot tougher. I think organisations will need to get a lot more clever around their attraction strategies and their packages that they put together in order to bring people over. So perhaps if medical insurance wasn't on the table before, they may want to look at that, for example, especially when it comes to, say, one-way moves instead of just a traditional assignment. Organisations will also have to start to consider, I think, alternative ways of working. The term remote working, virtual assignment, rise of the COVID workforce, whatever you want to call it, I think that's going to come like a bit of a wave. And I think a lot of organisations, although they will retain the traditional mobility models, you know, your short term, your long terms, your local pluses, they will be becoming more increasingly harder to facilitate due to the border restrictions and the number of legislative requirements that are in place in order to get someone from A to B. And so I think that organisations will need to increase and develop a hybrid approach when it comes to their mobility models. And mobility will then therefore need to work a lot more collaboratively with talent in order to facilitate that knowledge sharing around not only from a legislative point of view, staying ahead of those changes, but also understanding what their talent market is doing and perhaps being able to plug some of those talent gaps that they're seeing simply due to those restrictions.
Lynn, I'm watching you as you're listening to this, and it looks like this is resonating with you too. Are you seeing things like virtual assignments coming into play? Are you seeing things like work from home starting to change the mobility culture within your organization or not?
I think based on recent events, I think this has accelerated internal discussions around the future of work at Mars. So it's a lot broader than mobility, but what is our philosophy around the future of work? So this has spurred us to have workshops with our HR business partners, with talent, to discuss about the future of mobility, but also linking that to the future of work at Mars. And I think it boils down to philosophy. What is the enterprise philosophy on work? Are we now looking at moving jobs to people as opposed to the traditional approach of moving people to jobs? So I think that's a fundamental question that us as an organization will need to address. Virtual assignments, remote workers do crop up every now and then in the form of surprises when we find out that someone has been working remotely. So we deal with that on a reactive basis. But I think going forward, we do need to be more proactive in terms of identifying, what our philosophy is as an organization.
Yeah, and you say surprises, and we all kind of laugh, right? Because we're hearing these stories of where we're being notified. People are telling us that they're working from home. We're not telling people they're working from home, right? And then not only are they working from home, then they may choose to even move temporarily or permanently somewhere else. If any of you are able to share, has your company started to think about, allowing people to relocate voluntarily on their own to just have a different quality of life? I'm seeing now, I think it was Google that announced that they were actually allowing people to do this. If they had the permission to work from home, then therefore they could choose to relocate. Have you seen your organization consider this, or have you seen other organizations adopt this type of a policy? Anyone? Stephen?
It seems to be more prevalent in the tech industry. And I think it boils down to the nature of the role. So I think for employees who are in a digital space, technically you can perform your work anywhere in the world. Coming together in office space boosts creativity, boosts innovation, collaboration. But nowadays with advances in technology, with online tools, it becomes an easier process, perhaps. But for traditional companies like, say, Mars, where we have manufacturing plants and certain roles like sales, you do need a local workforce. You can't possibly do a sales job from another location. So I think ultimately it really depends on the role and the scope of the role, regional, global, regional versus local.
Stephen, I'm going to ask you actually about this, and I'm actually going to twist it a little bit. And I'm going to ask you kind of to maybe argue the other side, right? Is there a case for relocation in a post-COVID world? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of what's happened with COVID-19 is that people have been working remotely for the last 6 months, and quite often quite successfully with less distractions maybe, or more hours working at the laptop at home, but it hasn't worked for everyone. I think it does depend on the situation, it depends on the corporate culture, it depends on the technology they have available. And I do think we are, well, at Schneider Electric, we're getting quite a lot of requests, and I'm sure everyone else here, Karen and Lynn, have also been receiving those surprises. When you do get them, we are scrambling through our policies going, okay, something didn't go right. How do we address this? Do we package it up in some sort of way and have an exception to our policy? So what we're thinking about is, yes, we can accommodate all that. However, come to the mobility team first. We can then assess the risk, look at the cost implications, especially around compliance, and let's look at the talent profile as well. We won't do this for everyone, but depending on the situation, we would like to be able to consider it. And I think just echoing what Lynn was saying, other things that we consider in terms of approving this kind of personal arrangement is, does the time zone fit? If you're supporting the European market and you're sitting in Asia, really, is that sensible? All the corporate tax, transfer pricing, finance issues, we have to address that as well. And also from a talent strategy, if this is a permanent role where you're supposed to be a global talent and you're sitting in an obscure third country, is that really the right strategy from a business perspective? So lots of conversations going on. We're all trying to sort of find the right balance. And I think COVID-19 has really thrown that balance out the door. So I think it's going to be an interesting space. For us, we would like to accommodate it, but within reason.
Do you think that, Stephen, do you think though that relocations might come back after, come back next year or 2 years from now, and maybe have different drivers driving those decisions?
Yeah. What we're anticipating is that mobility will move further, I guess, down the generations. So it's really the early career, mid-career we're looking at right now, because shifting families across is adding a lot of duty of care. So why not relocate people at much younger stages before they settle down? And I think that's where we're noticing that there is a gap in our talent matrix. So that's where we'd like to focus in 2 years' time.
Karen, I'm going to ask you, have you seen a change in the demographic of your mobile population? Stephen was kind of describing a little bit generational change.
No, not yet, Ben. Although I can kind of align with Stephen's thinking and I guess putting his forecasting hat on. I could see where for some organisations that would be a clever strategic move. A lot of mobility programs choose to target those more developmental roles as succession planning, for example. And I think that the traditional, very expensive, 3 to 4 times annual salaries given to the exec levels is probably something that we'll see die out a little bit more so than it probably has. We've probably seen that die out a little bit in the last probably 4 or 5 years. And I think that focusing on the next generation, harnessing those generations that are coming through that want that development through being able to move and be mobile, we really need to some degree, not pander to it, but we need to make it part of the attraction piece of working for the organisation, whether it be the EVP or whether it be part of, the culture of the organisation. A lot of organisations peg their environment, their culture on that very thing around attracting talent. So I think it depends on the organisation. It's probably not necessarily something that the science sector will focus on from CSIRO's viewpoint, where I guess more focused on getting the right people at the right place at the right time. And being a science sector, we also have a lot of a lot of drivers around having people committed to certain locations because they're research based, and a lot of that work can't be done remotely or can't be done virtually. You need people in the labs. So, but I could see perhaps in Stephen or Lynn's world that would be a rising need.
You know, this is interesting as we talk about kind of changing things. Kay, I want to ask you, you know, you have tremendous experience in the region, and from a supplier standpoint, how have you seen the region, relocation and global mobility within the region changing?
If I look back, and I've been in Asia quite a long time, and in the relocation industry, I think the maturity of the relocation profession in Asia, you know, very often was embedded within an HR admin team in an organization. We can do it better than anybody else could. And that, I'll say partnering or outsourcing it's to leverage, whether it's around consistency across a region, you know, leveraging the cost, leveraging the service, and the intellectual property that an expert in the relocation profession can bring. But I think the maturity of that market also has brought another level of, I'll say, savvy purchasers in terms of the transferees, in terms of the corporate clients. And when I look across you know, Asia is so broad, very different than when you look at the Americas or Europe. And talking about those borders, again, that knowledge around what we need to do in order to get people to be able to move. So the visa migration is a critical element that ties in. And then the nuances between each of those locations are so significantly different, and the cultural aspects, the compliance. You know, where we cover, we're Asia proper, I'll put it that way. We actually don't cover down into the Australia, New Zealand, or to India. And when you're looking at, you know, Hong Kong or Singapore, Tokyo as world-class cities that in terms of compliance are right up there at the top level. And then you look to Burma, Myanmar, and you look to Indonesia, the Philippines, where it's a little more opaque and a little less transparent. So especially in the time of COVID right now, there are other challenges that layer in that mobility piece. So as I've seen it, if I look back over the number of years, I would say the rising of the service expectation, certainly the cost pressures have been driving things down. I think it's a very challenging environment. And it's interesting as you're talking about, you know, the mobility and talent and attracting the right people. In a number of our client conversations, both with RMCs and client direct, there's actually a lot of conversation around that, you know, the balance of work life, of where they want to be. The duty of care of asking somebody to go, and the potential litigious ramifications somewhere in the future. And then are we going to be looking at an environment where, while we might say that the traditional assignment has shifted and we want to keep those costs down and we're not making it a huge financial incentive, there may be cost of living allowances or incentive pays, almost the hardship allowances to entice people to go to certain markets because of COVID and what they may be giving up.
You know, Kay, I appreciate those comments, and you broached, you know, talking about the differences in the countries and the difficulties inherent in all, and it brought up an idea to me, and I want to ask Stephen, I want to ask you about this. How do you source for suppliers, and you know, how do you source for suppliers across such a diverse region with so many different countries and areas?
Sure, thanks, Ben. I think in the Asia region, because it is diverse, as you mentioned, you just have to know the right people in each market. It's quite challenging, actually. So, for example, in Schneider Electric, we work with pretty much a lot of different movers, each specialist in their own country. Yeah, it's and the language barriers also make it very difficult. And I think in terms of the compliance around shipping, it's also quite difficult as well.
Lynn, I'd like to ask you, what do you look for when you consider supplier relationships?
So I look for thought leadership, collaboration, you know, really understanding the mass culture, our ways of working, and really partnering us hand in hand. And I think if I think back about my expectations when I work with our suppliers, I always encourage them to put themselves in our shoes, walk in the customer's shoes, trying to anticipate what we might ask and being prepared. So I tend to ask them to think along the lines of the what, so what, and the what now. So with every situation that we get presented with, in order to have a productive conversation with us, not only think about the what, but think about the so what and the what now. And I think those two things are sometimes are blind spots for some suppliers, and we are constantly drilling to our partners that to try to think along those lines, so that we can have a much better collaborative partnership.
Lynn, you bring up a great point, and I think you said so what and what now. The questions that you pose back to your supply chain, and since we're all kind of suppliers here watching this right now, and go ahead and get active in the comments and leave your questions there. We're going to discuss those in the open Q&A portion. So just go ahead and just leave some comments there if you're watching this right now. But I wanted to ask you, because we're all looking for advice, right, and thought leadership of our own, right? So Lynn, why do you think that maybe that disconnect exists sometimes? Not saying it's pervasive, and obviously I'm sure you've worked through it over the years. I'm sure it's in a great place now. But what is it that we should know as suppliers when wanting to do business with a company such as yours, and what are some of the challenges that you see us working through that maybe we can kind of be more proactive about?
Right. If I were to distill it really simply, my counsel would be, don't just address the symptoms, but think about root cause. So again, going back to the what, very often it's skimming the surface in terms of, okay, we'll find out what's happening. But that could be just identifying symptoms, but if we drill down to root cause analysis, and I think that provides the opportunity for learning, and that translates into the so what and the what now. So what can we do better? If we could do this again, what could we do differently?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I could see a lot of movers, that not necessarily being a skill set that we all possess top of mind, right? We're just trying to get boxes on trucks sometimes, right? So taking a step back and thinking strategically is difficult sometimes. It's great. Karen, I'd like to ask the same thing of you. What are some advice maybe you'd give to some suppliers that are watching this?
Sure. Well, in a previous life, I have done an APAC RFP for immigration and removal services, and it was huge. We went, I think at the time we went from, I think it was 144 suppliers across those two areas down to one. And obviously the task of the exercise was vendor consolidation, but not only for the sake of doing vendor consolidation, but we were really looking, to Lynn's point, around partnering with subject matter experts who knew their field really well and could tell us things that we didn't know. For us, it was really important at the time for the proposers and then the selected vendor that we went with to really have the patience to take us through and help us understand some of those compliance areas that Kay talked about earlier, especially in APAC. Myanmar is one location that springs to mind where I learned so much that I've probably now even forgot it. I've parked it back there somewhere. So I guess first and foremost is having the patience to walk your customer through those nuances. And to add to what Lynn mentioned about the what, so what, I would say for vendors, understand the why the organisation is moving people, what's their core objective around their mobility program and what drives their mobility program. And then the last thing I'd probably say is when you're submitting a response to an RFP, make sure that you make it as easy as possible on the vendor from the customer, from the perspective of making sure that all submissions are put through on one standard template so that the customer can compare apples with apples and the whole process is a lot more streamlined.
Love it. Stephen, I'm going to ask you something similar there. I mean, people are watching this, right? And they're looking for some advice and some leadership on things. How would, what's the advice you'd give to a supplier who wants to do business with you, let's say?
Sure. I think for me, it's around policy and process. I would like to adhere to my policy when it comes to relocation. I'd also like to adhere to my global process. So if you can understand both of those, then you'll make it very easy for me to transact with you. So for me, I think it's understanding why things are done in a certain way. What is the policy around it? How does it convert into a shipment allowance? What is possible? What is not possible? Then it is around the process. How does this work? Does it go through one of the relocation management companies? What's the engagement level there between the client and the RMC? How does that filter down in terms of the workload that you receive as well? Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And I know it answers a lot of people's questions out there. And if you still have more questions about it, please leave it in the comments there and we'll go ahead and we'll interact with you there as well. Kay, as a supplier leader who has been successful in the region, what is some advice that you would give to other suppliers that are watching this that want to also be successful?
I say be courageous and fearless. Sometimes we get so focused on doing the tactical things. We have to do the work and check the boxes. When you were saying about packing boxes, there's certain things you need to do. But very often we're so focused on getting the job done that we forget to be consultative. We forget to bring our intellectual property and the knowledge that we've had from other experiences to the table. And if something isn't going the way as planned, to also be transparent. There's no point in hiding anything because it's just going to get under the rock and grow hairy legs and become a bigger monster than you can ever control. And it's really about that partnership and engagement. Especially COVID-19 has also brought this to light, where when we don't know something, some personalities lean out and some personalities lean in. And, when we're on our own, I'm great at brainstorming by myself. I can always get myself to an agreement, but it may not be the right answer to take back, right? So also being very consultative within the group, that very often somebody else has had experience or knowledge that we can then leverage. So making sure communication is always there. It's open, it's honest, it's transparent. And in my time, I'm part of the Asian Tigers group, right? We have a long legacy in Asia and our expertise is in that area. Is really leveraging that to its best to bring the value forward in everything that we do. And it just would be, please be fearless, not foolish, be fearless.
I appreciate the distinction. I need that sometimes. So thank you very much for the distinction there. There was a Karen, you and I have had conversations, before, and one of the things that we've kind of debated, or one of the things that you've tendered for debate, is the mobility process, is the mobility industry dying? And I think it's a very courageous, to Kay's point, it's a very courageous topic, right? And I think we have some thought leaders that could really shed some light on this. So Karen, what is your thought around that? And then I'd like to debate this with our esteemed panelists here.
Well, firstly, my thought is I am crazy because I'll be putting myself out of work. So if anybody's got a job, feel free to leave that in the comments. But I guess to answer your question as bluntly as I can, Ben, no, I don't think so. I think, though, however, global mobility will probably take its biggest shift than it has in the whole 14 to 15 years I've been working in this space. I think this is the biggest shift we're going to see as practitioners. I think we're going to move away from some of that, certainly after the initial period of shock sets in and we get ourselves recentered and realigned. I think we'll move away from that reactive and even to some degree heighten that strategic approach that we've had. We're going to become, I guess, the go-to people for greater focus around risk assessment for moving people, full stop. So, and I won't just draw the line there assignments or mobility. I'd include business travel in that. And I know that business travel falls into some global mobility practitioners' remit and it doesn't for others. But I think regardless of where that particular function sits, I think that subject matter around the risk assessments that are going to be needed when sending people out is going to be housed and sit within mobility, quite rightly. I think that we're going to be the go-to people for ensuring that all of those displaced people that are either still out there or still surprising us by rearing themselves every now and again, we're going to be those firefighters that continually put out those fires around compliance obligations for those displaced people. I think we're going to be the trailblazers around establishing the new ways of working offshore, again, speaking around that virtual workforce, and setting up the constructs around that where organisations don't have either entities already or they haven't even considered that kind of working style at all. And I think we're going to heighten, as I said, that strategic collaboration with talent, with finance around tax and compliancy. And while we build and pull together that hybrid model, we're no longer going to be that kind of standard stock traditional model, service orientated. We're going to be far more flexible around how we deliver the services, and we have to be a lot more empathetic as well.
That's fascinating. Lynn, I want to ask you something similar. I mean, is global mobility dying or just changing? And what does it mean to movers, right? I mean, I'm going to take a very high level strategic question and then also ask you to kind of boil it down for us here. So is it dying or just changing? And what does it mean for movers?
It's a difficult one.
It's a hard one. I know. I left the hard one for the end there for you, didn't I?
I'm going to go with it depends. I know it feels like it's sitting on the fence, but I say it depends because the purpose of mobility differs from organization to organization, depending on how mature the program is, and also depending on how mature talent management is in the organization. So I think for matured organizations, I see mobility perhaps morphing into a new space. I think there probably needs to be new sets of competencies that have to be built on, not just on traditional mobility, but in order for us to up our game, I think we need to play more in other HR areas in addition to mobility. So a little bit of that reward space, talent space. So I see mobility probably morphing into a more hybrid approach in a program that's probably more established and more mature. On the other hand, if a program is, say, fairly small, fairly simple, not much mobility going on, it may stay where it is. It may go through maybe a more outsourced model. I think it depends on whether the organization wants high touch, low touch, more transactional sort of mobility piece. So it really depends on where a company is in terms of that continuum or the spectrum of mobility establishment, if you like.
Stephen, I want to ask you, as we look towards the future, how do we as suppliers, especially in the moving, let's kind of keep it to the moving, how do we maybe become the supplier of the future for you as the programs are changing, and as to Lynn and Karen's point, as things are changing, right, and you're doing different things maybe, right, and maybe some of our services from a relocation, physically relocating household goods, may or may not be as in demand in the future. Is there a way that we could modify what we do or augment what we do in order to provide new value?
Sure. I see the industry changing quite significantly. There's technology solutions everywhere, and I think you are seeing quite a lot of different technology platforms out there, and that's quite a disruptor. In terms of me working with a moving company, I think someone mentioned before getting that data, telling us what we don't know. That to me is quite important. So, for example, if you can tell me what are our top 10 shipping lanes, then that is something I don't know right now.
Sure.
I'm sure I've got the data for it, but I haven't had the time to digest that. If you could show me that, I'd be like, wow, that's interesting. Okay, that shows me where I need to focus. So in terms of aligning with the strategy as well, that there are things you could tell us which I don't know about my program.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's a real opportunity for all of us, is to improve our reporting capabilities and then also do something with the data, right? So now what, right? So Kay, I'm going to ask you kind of similarly around technology. What do you see happening in the future in order for us to all become better suppliers, and how might we use technology, software, processes, things like that to be better?
Yeah, I think, the transformational point, and it's not just around COVID-19, right? This has been a wave of bringing technology in and using it. So there's an element about having technology internally to help us with our productivity, our efficiency, the communication, tracking, knowing where things are and what's been happening. And if somebody's out for the day, that you can continue on the movement of all those elements. I think the element around technology and our clients, very often we're being asked to have technology and it looks super sexy on there, and it's all shiny and glossy for when, the procurement time comes. But are our clients actually using it and engaging with it? So with Silk Relo, we have a technology platform that ties across all our countries, as well as having apps, right? That are, because, users are different today than they were in the past, and wanting to have real-time information at the touch of a device, whether it's on a laptop or a mobile device, to know what's going on, where it is, and how it's working. The data integrity is critical. And I see, if I'm looking with my magic looking glass or my fairy wand for the day, would be that we have more interconnectedness between our supply chain and the organization, so that we break down the barriers that are currently there, that we're working in our silos, either by country or location, and that we're really leveraging the entire globe to bring it together. The value proposition to the clients, the transferee, why do I have to tell you if I've already told somebody else, right? Being able to bring that information back. As Stephen mentioned, having valuable data points that are important to an organization so they can make meaningful decisions and what they're doing, how they're doing it, when they're doing it. And back to that, what, so what, and what now. We're at pivot points and transformational points that, when you're asking me, what's the future going to look like, it is going to be extraordinarily different than it was ever in the past. And it's about us embracing it and being fearless and courageous to do it. It's really hard on the intellectual property. We've got to really communicate across our community of what best practices there are to leverage those and not hold them as the state secret that's like the school test and we hide it away instead of sharing.
You bring up some great points, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments as well, as we're speaking about technology. Kay, you bring up a great point. I've heard this before, that we design all this technology and we do it because it sells, right? It's the sizzle, but it doesn't necessarily get the utilization that we think, right? And we say, oh, customers want choice and they want transparency and they want, they want things at their fingertips. But they're not always using these things that we develop. And I'd like to now shift over to kind of our clients over here, right, who represent the user groups. And I know that you're not using the technology now, and so I'm not going to ask you specifically for app functionality and things like that. But I do want to ask you, where are your transferees going for information? Because I sense that maybe asking them to go to our applications or our mobile sites maybe isn't the place to put this. And I'm wondering, where are your transferees going for information, and how could we integrate in a more meaningful way with your systems potentially? And I want to ask that question of all of you, and I'd ask for one of you to go first. Karen, you chuckled loudest. Go.
It's not hard then. Well, I'll be the first to say we're not using technology probably as well as we could. We're a bit old-fashioned in the sense that we literally write an email if we want to know where something's up to. So there's not much technology around that. Although I would add, though, while I chew up a little bit more airtime before I put Lynn and Stephen on, is that I think someone mentioned that, you can have that information, but what you do with it is really important. So, and in the context of COVID right now, it's really important, because I had an example the other day where I had a gentleman and his shipping was on the way back. And because we in Melbourne have been in complete lockdown, you haven't been able to physically go and view rental properties. And so we were reaching kind of a precipice point where his things were about to hit. He had nowhere to go, nowhere to put these things. And it took me as a mobility person in between those processes to kind of identify that and say, hey, to the mover, he may not be ready to take this. He's telling me he's not ready to take this, but the two probably key people in the situation weren't talking. And so I would have probably liked to have seen in that instance those two people talking, not necessarily through technology, although that probably would have been great because then he could see it live and made some decisions for himself. But it's that value add. And I think Kay mentioned using that information to then consult and draw conclusions and add value to say, hey, John, your things are arriving here. I understand you don't have a rental property, but hey, let's just put that into storage a little bit longer for you. And rather than coming to me as a mobility person who by all accounts is going to be moving into more of a strategic place. So I think relocations and removals can add a lot more value moving forward around rolling up the sleeves and picking up some of that slack where I think mobility just doesn't have the bandwidth to do anymore. I mean, we were already stretched before, but if we're going to move into this whole other space, there's a big piece of work there around some of the bits and pieces that we do that need to be picked up.
Thank you, Karen. Lynn, I'd like to ask you the same question, or basically, how can we use technology to be better partners and integrate and provide a better employee experience for your transferees and assignees?
Yeah, I think integration between systems will be great. I think for us, we are actually going through a behavioral mindset shift with our assignees. So we just went live with Assignment Pro last year, launched the employee portal within April, but that's not integrated with our relocation providers at the moment. And I think that's an opportunity that we can look at integration. So I think the more suppliers that have, say, APIs that link with our systems, the better, because then it becomes a more seamless relocation experience all around. And I think if we manage to change the mindset of employees being more self-service, I think it makes life easier for everyone. It's not just mobility people, but it's for relocation consultants as well. Because if everything's on an app, see those workflows coming through, you don't necessarily have to, email or call for a status update. So I think there is an opportunity there for better integration, but I think equally, once you manage to do that, it's for the company and us mobility professionals to work on changing the mindsets of our relocating employees to be more self-sufficient.
Yeah, that's interesting, changing the mindsets of the employees, right? I mean, I think that technology's been changing the mindset of people, but I wonder why it hasn't necessarily taken hold as well with the mobile workforce. Stephen, I'd like to ask you similarly, how could we utilize technology better?
Yeah, sure. Schneider Electric is one of the departments we have is around industrial automation, and our culture is around digitization of electronic information, energy information. So we've got the culture around digitization, and just like Lynn said, she's gone through, or Mars has gone through an exercise of implementing technology. We've gone with Polaris, and we're building those APIs with our relocation management companies. A lot of our, data is held in that platform. For us, we definitely want the APIs built into everything we do. So when it comes to working with lots of relocation management companies and their suppliers, we do expect that data to flow through.
Wonderful, Stephen. Now, this is part of the this is the fun part right here. So now we're going to give you the opportunity to ask questions of our esteemed panelists, whether it be regarding supplier relation type questions, whether it be COVID-19 questions, during and post, right? Whether it be technological questions. This is your opportunity to engage now with our panelists. So very excited about that. Thanks for hanging in there as we kind of chatted. Now we want to hear from you. So go ahead and get your questions ready, and let's go ahead and take those questions now. Hey, this was fun. You guys did a great job. I mean, I'm a little bit biased, but I don't think we could have chose a better panel to kick off the 58th annual IAM meeting. Okay, I mean, what do you think? I think give yourself just a round of applause real quick. Okay. All right. If we were in person, you'd be getting a huge round of applause right now. Yeah, well done. We've got a ton of great questions. I want to make sure we get to all of them. But before we do, we want to go ahead and thank our sponsor for this session. Our sponsor is Aversal Global Relocations. They're a leading provider of international moving services from North America and Europe to Asia for corporate and government clients. Aversal is the only forwarder who is a minority business enterprise and service-disabled veteran-owned small business in the United States. They are GSA approved and waiting for your move. Awesome. Thanks, Jose. A shout out to you. This was great. We have a ton of wonderful questions here. I want to just hop right into it, okay? Let's see. First one comes to us from, let me just scroll here. Brian's feeding me these questions. There's so much here going on. Let's see here. First one is from Titi Tirawat from Boon Ma in Thailand. Given the WHO, World Health Organization, ranking that Thailand is the #1 country for controlling the COVID-19 pandemic, does the panel think Thailand can become a new home of many global companies? Kind of a strategic question. Who wants to take that one? Stephen, I'm going to go to you with that one. What do you think?
Sure.
Thailand, the new home of global business?
Problem. It's an interesting question because it's quite relevant to what's happening in Asia. Hong Kong, with its challenges at the moment, a lot of there is change happening here. Singapore, there's a lot of attraction there as well. However, there's certain elements which is making it less attractive in certain aspects. Some of the discussions I've been having with the global mobility industry here is that what could be other locations which are on the rise. China being such a large market, doesn't make sense to move to China. Tokyo, I think, is coming up with some compelling arguments to move there as well, and definitely Thailand with the I guess the quality of the infrastructure and the workforce. I think that's quite attractive as well. There's quite a lot of dynamic discussions happening in this region.
Lynn, are you having these same types of discussions about potentially looking at countries, maybe how they've handled things or how they position themselves otherwise for opening business units?
I would say actually not exactly. COVID-19 government response is probably one of the factors, but when we look at where to place our factories or offices, there is a whole slew of factors that get taken into consideration. I think I mentioned quite briefly in the chat that, apart from, say, government response, typically what tends to be forefront of discussions are around cost of doing business, talent availability, talent retention, so on and so forth. Economic, political stability.
Sure.
So for us, in terms of Thailand, we do have a big presence there, but that's really from a manufacturing or technical leadership standpoint. But what I tend to see is for more strategic sort of leadership roles, Singapore, Hong Kong still tends to play a stronger tends to have a stronger foothold because of talent availability, and that seems to be one of the more important factors that we consider as an organization.
That makes sense. Kay, really kind of quickly on this one, do you see a difference in the flow of relocation volumes depending on the country's response to COVID or how well they've responded?
And I'll say yes. And at the moment, the very real challenge we have is that borders are still impacted with restrictions. So that we're seeing, I would say, a more overall net outflow at this point in time, as whether folks are repatriating or a couple of clients that we have had 100% requirement of a return of all short-term and business travelers from a duty of care perspective, right? And also the industry sector. It's quite interesting as I'm looking through our data as we're doing our Q3 and planning for our budget into the 2021 and beyond. Looking at the sectors, because certainly we are seeing a rise in the medical area, laboratories, research, and other areas that are coming into Asia. And then there's some others that have taken a strategy of completely hunkered down and contracting. One client, and it's quite significant, said they had a 99% decrease in their mobility activity. As a corporate strategy, their duty of care was more important than any of their other business drivers at this point in time. So it's quite interesting.
That's great. We've got some other questions here, and I know that we're all kind of interacting here in the chat, so I know everybody appreciates that. We can hear typing, so just let's see here. Karen, let's see. We got some great questions. I just want to go through these and make sure we get to all of them. Brian says, question. Brian sent me a question from David Powell from Montway in Illinois. What is your employee base wanting in terms of returning to the office? I heard recently that a large multinational corporation surveyed its employees and 2/3 want to remain in the work from home environment. I mean, I think this is at the forefront of all of our minds because we're all kind of, going through this personally and professionally. So what is your employee base wanting in terms of returning to the office? Karen, I want to start with you.
Sure. Well, at CSIRO, I guess we're a little bit unique in the fact that some of our work is lab or office based, so you can't get away from it, so to speak. There is a large portion of the employee base, though, that can and is working remotely. In Australia, I guess just at a high level, societally, there seems to be a big split between whether people want to return or whether they don't. Certainly in a CBD sense, there is the big considerations around getting people up the lifts and back down the lifts at the start and the end of the day. I think one organisation had a look at that, and I think it was going to take them all day to get everyone up and all day to get everyone back. So I think they're going to have to think about how they split their rosters around bringing staff in, splitting days, mixing it up. But from a CSIRO point of view, their focus is 100% on health and safety first and foremost right now. And so they have a very structured plan around staging the return back to site, and various parts of the country around Australia at the moment, and certainly some of our offshore sites as well are all sitting at different stages depending on the level of the pandemic at any given point.
I want to ask this question in two ways, and I'm going to direct it to Lynn and Stephen as well. What are the employees asking for, and what is the business asking for around work from home? Lynn?
So I do see employees asking for more flexibility. And that flexibility sometimes comes with risk, and we need to assess that risk. So I think it's about balancing the requests with the risk involved. And based on some of the cases requests that I've come across, I think that what tends to be a more engaging discussion is that we as a business offer the employees some options, and they're then empowered to select those options, right? And the options could be, yes, you can work remotely for maybe 1 to 3 months, but after that, if you do not come back to the original location of work, then you have to go on unpaid leave or you have to leave the business indefinitely. And I think when employees have options available to them and they feel empowered to make a decision, it just makes for a more engaging experience overall.
That makes a lot of sense. I think if I was an employee, I would question, like let's just say 3 months hypothetically, right? I know here in the States, March was the start. 3 months later was June. It was terrible. And then it improved. And now here we are 3 months later, and we're back to terrible again, and it's like, well, sometimes at this time we're kind of figuring it out as we go along. And some of these timelines, maybe kind of arbitrary and frankly our best guesses, right? And how do they change? Stephen, I want to ask you the same question. What are employees asking and what is the business asking for?
Sure. We've actually gone through that exercise and we've asked globally, what do people want post-COVID? Interestingly, it depends on the country and the culture. So you can't have one, I guess, generalization across the world.
Give
What
me
I
an
do
example of
find
that. I
is,
think that's really
yeah,
interesting, if you don't
yeah,
mind.
yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah, I think the Americans are definitely more likely to work from home. I think we've seen that for decades with a lot of multinationals in the US. I've worked with colleagues who permanently work from home, and that was something they did 20 years ago. So when COVID-19 came through, working from home was accepted. Whereas on the other side of that, in Asia, where you do need to be in the office a little bit more, I do think there is more hesitation around people working from home, and I think if you look at cultures, the Chinese, Korean, Japanese might be less likely to work from home. Um, the other thing to maybe look at it from the business perspective is how do you measure productivity? I would like to think during COVID-19, working from home in Hong Kong, I was pretty productive. I was working quite long hours, and I had to force myself to take breaks. If globally the whole workforce was doing that, then do you see productivity go up? Is that a good thing for business? The other thing I'd probably throw out there is not all roles are. It's appropriate to have them working from home. For example, if you're managing a team, you actually need to be on site with your team. So I think it depends on the case. It might be appropriate in certain circumstances and it might not be so appropriate in others. And I guess you need to come up with some sort of framework and an approval process as well. So if it's not appropriate, then someone has to say no, and would it be HR?
Right. No, fantastic, and I think it's kind of an existential question as a moving industry, right, that we're facing, and I appreciate y'all tackling it too. So we have a question here from Ajit Venkatesh with Globe Moving. As a corporate, why do you prefer working with RMCs for moving services? What should the movers do to make corporates work with them directly? That's a fantastic question, Ajit. I'm going to start with Stephen. You seem to have the biggest smile on your face. That's what I'm going with from now on. Okay, no credentials here. Who's smiling the broadest? Stephen, you're first.
Thanks for that, Ben. I was actually smiling at Kay. I was thinking she might have an appropriate answer. So we're all smiling at each other. I think for myself, there is, I guess, technology is coming into play, and there is that Uberization of everything. And for me, it's I look after the region. Uh, I I struggle with working with so many different movers in each different country. So for me, having a relocation management company in there helps me focus on my KPIs, whereas I think the relocation management company can provide regional consistency. They can follow, they understand our policies, and they will apply it whether it's in India or Thailand or Japan. So for me, it's really giving that global consistency or regional consistency, and having the employees have, I guess, a one-stop shop when it comes to addressing things.
Yeah, I think that's a great
How's
point. I
that?
think as mover, I think that's a great point. I think as movers, we might oversimplify your roles, right? And understanding of the nuance and the complexity and the balls in the air that you're juggling, right? But Lynn, I'm going to position the question to you as well, and I'm going to flip it and ask you to imagine a what if, right? Or how could we? So Ajit's question is, as a corporate, why do you prefer working with RMCs for movers? What should movers do to make corporates work with them directly?
Well, I actually responded to Ajit's question in the chat, but I didn't respond to the second one, which is the question that you just posed. I think if I were to have this crystal ball or magic wand, for me, it will boil down to technology. If, let's say, if we had a fantastic platform where all our different suppliers have this, I spoke about APIs earlier, have this API that links everything together, and assuming that services are seamless, then I think that will encourage corporates to work with movers directly. I think the concern is that if things don't go right and there's an escalation process, I think us as corporates, we don't want to deal with the escalation process. We would prefer to outsource that and yeah, look at symptoms, address root cause, and I think so that we as corporates can do what we do best and movers can do what they do best. And I think that for me is it goes back to efficiency, but if in a perfect situation, then I think technology would be an enabler.
Yeah, and I love during our questions earlier, you talked about doing assignment pro, I think was what you said, and there being opportunities potentially to integrate there, and I can understand that. You might still need the move management layer to handle escalations, to direct traffic a little bit. Karen, I'm going to pose the same question to you because I think it's really what our audience wants to hear. As a corporate, why do you prefer working with RMCs for moving services? What should the movers do to make corporates work with them directly?
It's a good question, Ben, and I'm glad someone asked because it shows, I guess, that they're willing to be, I guess, think outside the box and be a bit more flexible with their service delivery. So, as you will recall from our session, I mentioned I did a regional RFP in a previous life where we took 144 suppliers, and a great deal of them were movers, and we reduced that down to quite a small number. Now, one of the things that we learned through that process was that flexibility around collaborations with the other elements of the relocation, so immigration, destination services, those bits and pieces was really key because, to Lynn's point, as a mobility practitioner, you want to be able to kind of take it at that higher level, understand where the pain points are, remedy the kind of the root causes, as Lynn referred to them as. You don't want to be getting into the weeds of each individual request, exception request, for example. You kind of want someone to look after that piece. So when you have certain dependencies in the end-to-end delivery of a relocation, so for example, you need the visa in order to move the goods. As a mobility person, you've got so much going on. You don't want to have to be watching those bits and pieces to connect them together. You want someone to do that. So I think if movers had the view, I learned through my process, if they were flexible around willing to collaborate with other subject matter expertise, so immigration providers, for example, or destination standalone providers, then great, that's something that they can look at doing. But if not, then they're going to find themselves, I guess, in a tough position because they've niched themselves in one particular area, and they need to be cognizant of that whole end-to-end process that the mobility person is really dealing with.
Makes a lot of sense.
And probably just
yeah, sure, Kay.
Yeah.
Okay,
If I can just chime in, and I'm quite a visual person, so if you think about, and many of our participants, it's IAM, it's movers, right? And that is our core business, and that's the lens that we see it through. And for mobility professionals, this is, if you think about fabric, right, and you weave together the fibers of the fabric, there's a thread that is there, that is the moving element, right? It's a critical in the as an element of bringing it all together if you have a relocation that is going to physically move somebody's personal effects. And for mobility professionals, they really only have two hands. They become an octopus. And it's not with just 8 tentacles. It's there's so many touch points in what they are dealing with to get a transferee relocated. So certainly, while movers want to have a seat at the table and be heard and lend value, and certainly, I don't know a mover that doesn't want to be in control of the mover and be the booking agent and be the lead on a program. The very real nature of where the profession has moved us is there are aggregators, and there's procurement involved. And when Karen's talking about an RFP that went from 144 down to perhaps it's a handful, perhaps it's one. This is about streamlining, consistency, and as you noted, technology is something that can really bring us together to work differently, so that every mover can have a seat at the table of being part of that supply chain.
I love that, and I think that's what movers strive for, right? Just as HR professionals and mobility professionals strive to have a seat at the table. We're all searching for relevance and for voice, right? I'm glad you brought up procurement, because that brings us to our next question. This question is from Hosea Botley from Aversal Global Relocations, our sponsors. Thank you again, Hosea. He says, in the U.S. and other regions, diversity, equity, and inclusion are huge procurement goals for companies. How do you ensure that your RMCs and forwarders are using diverse supply chains? I'm going to start with you, Lynn. I like how I'm going to start with you, ... Lynn. Does that make sense there?
I am going to say I'm not sure because it hasn't been a focus area for us.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that's fine, and that's honest, and I appreciate it, because this is also about taking the temperature of the region and understanding kind of what's at play, right? Because something that's at play in a big way in one region may not be even an issue in another. Stephen, I'd like to ask you the same question. Is this something that you at Schneider Electric deal with?
Yeah, we're at the opposite end. So we take items like that quite seriously. So I've been sitting in some procurement meetings where social responsibility does form a large part of I guess the KPIs in terms of selecting vendors. One of the goals of Schneider Electric is to make energy available for quite a lot of people around the world who don't have access to it. So that's one aspect. Diversity and inclusion is threaded into our organization as well. And I think when you look at procurement, one of their drivers is to make sure that our values are passed down as well. So that is a great question, and I'm happy to say that I've sat through meetings where this is discussed openly.
Is it something where, because I think you all have a managed approach. So Stephen, I'm going to stay with you just for a moment. Is it something where you actually go to the relocation management company and have like certain, you mentioned KPIs, certain goals, and then you measure them back against those, or do you direct suppliers that you know for a fact to be diverse?
I think we will. Yeah, I think we'll work with organizations which already show that commitment. I think there's some form of certification out there, and that's one of the requirements of being considered as one of our suppliers. And I think because diversity is such a strong element, I think having the right, ratio of diversity is a requirement. And being a French organization as well, they do take this quite seriously, as well as most other organizations, Americans and Australians as well. It's an interesting topic to
I love it. I love it. Karen, I'm gonna ask you the same thing, and I want to get an Australian perspective here and understand: is in Australia and with CSIRO, is diversity, equity, and inclusion a major initiative or not? And if it is a major initiative, how do you ensure the diversity, equity, and inclusion of your supply chain?
So I guess to answer your question, it's huge. Yes, diversity inclusion is big in CSIRO. So for those who aren't aware from around the globe on the call, CSIRO is a public sector government organisation, and it's essentially Australia's science agency. So, so I guess when it comes to ensuring that thread is fed through to our partners, I'm happy to say that is procurement's job first and foremost. But when it comes to, I guess, working through our partners that we look at when we consider them for ongoing work, I would second what Stephen says in the fact that they would need to be advocates from it before approaching us to partner with. And they would need to be doing active steps and quite a strong advocate for that in their space themselves. And so when we're looking to partner, the values that organisation has mirror our organisational values as well.
That's wonderful. Kay, I wanted to ask you, as a person that manages, diverse, not diverse, but it manages supply chains all over the region, right? Just by the nature of what you do at Silk Relo. Is diversity, equity, inclusion part of your supply chain strategy, or is something else more important or kind of more at the forefront?
And it's interesting because there's a lot of topics. I also sit on a board that's a Human Resources Certification Institute, and we've just launched some sessions for the HR community in that space. And this is, as a human being, you want to be relevant, and that equality element and the inclusion. Diversity from the lens of where you sit as your country and your company culture also has a different lens of understanding. Right.
Right.
So if
so
I was
you
sitting
mean it
in the
means
United
something
States,
different in the United States versus Hong
yeah,
Kong?
and the regulatory environment in Hong Kong or in the UK or Australia, European countries, in comparison to what might be deemed in Hong Kong or in Myanmar, for example, again, there's a huge educational point, and that's something that we're very focused on at this point in time. And I think in this last week, I've had 5 or 6 calls just on that topic alone, because it is important to our clients. It is important to the RMCs that we work with. In our supply chain, many of them, this hasn't been in the lens, right, of their looking glass of what they've been looking at, but if from a world news context and listening to what's occurring in the States, what's occurring in other markets, it's very relevant to us and very important. And I speak with our team members. I spend a lot of time doing training on compliance. And there's regulatory compliance, what a government is going to state, whether you look at GDPR or you're looking at Foreign Corruption Practices Act. I then look at the contractual compliance, right? When we're engaged with a company or we're engaging a company, what do we put in the terms and clauses, the KPIs that are important and are the expectations? And diversity is usually included in that when you're dealing with multinational companies. And then the most important is about our behavioral compliance. And this speaks to the culture of our organization, the vision, and what leadership communicates as the expectation related to code of ethics, related to behavioral points, and who we are as individuals in our Silk Relo, in our Asian Tigers group, and who we need to be when nobody is looking for our clients and our transferees in the community we serve. So it's critical for me, and is an initiative that we're spending time of recognizing that we need to pull our socks up a little bit higher and really get on with this program.
I love it. I love it. And I love the point about diversity takes on different meanings depending on what region and what perspective you're coming from, and inclusion. We've got a couple more questions. Let's see if we can fit them all in here. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate this, the time here. We've got Brad Chapman from Royal Alaskan Movers. What tax impacts are companies beginning to face from U.S. states who find out companies have employees working in their state because they are working from home? Now, Brad's question is from a U.S. perspective, but I want to flip that and ask if those same tax implications are occurring in Asia and Australia. And I want to ask, I'm going to ask Lynn. what your thoughts are about that.
Stephen was hiding.
Yeah, she's like,
I was gonna go Stephen. He was smiling, but I was like, no, I got to give Lynn some time here.
So yes, it is a challenge. So when we approach these sorts of remote working activities that land on our desk, it is very much reactive, and we immediately go into seek to understand and then problem solve. So in terms of that, we typically engage with our tax advisors to check if there are any thresholds that we can make use of, and if those thresholds are, if we are within threshold, then it's fine. But if it's beyond the threshold, then I think that's where we need to have that crucial conversation with the business and with the employee to say that this is going to create an issue, from a personal tax standpoint, for you as an employee, but also for us, it also implicates us in terms of having employer withholding obligations or reporting obligations in another country. So it is complicated, and again, it has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And unfortunately, sometimes we do have to spend extra fees to get professional advice from our tax advisors.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to ask you the question a little bit differently. Do your employees understand the craziness that they put you through when they choose to just unilaterally go work somewhere else? And how do you deal with it?
That doesn't happen in my world.
I have a feeling Stephen's doing this, the whole time.
Yes. So I think when people are on our mobility programs, great, they've got the tax support, we can identify them, we know who they are, we can address that fairly quickly. It's the ones we don't know about, and I think going back to the original question is people in the US where they're working from home in a different state, will that trigger US state obligations? Yeah, it's the ones you don't know about which will come and bite you later. So I think as an organization we've identified that, and we've started communicating with our HR communities to basically say, if you know of anyone, let us know, because we only know about the people that you tell us about. So we've gone through that exercise, and I think maybe while everyone's on this call, it's we are coming up to year end. It's not that far away. Let's get the withholding done, hopefully by November. So December, you'll have a nice Christmas. Otherwise, next year you're going to have some underreporting, and it's too late to fix it. So I think I've been on one call with the US where I think the payroll managers at the moment are really tearing their hair out because this is a real issue.
Yeah. Karen, does this happen? Australia is a large geographic country with, territories and states within it. Does this happen for you a lot? And are there implications about going across these borders internally?
Yeah, I mean, domestically within Australia, we obviously don't have the problem, but we have I had to excuse me. Getting late here. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice after a full day.
And we do have to cut it too. So, I mean, it's okay. You can just say, Ben, we don't have that problem.
Not at all. It's a big challenge. We are unearthing people every day. I had one today that I discovered, and I've filled out a nice big spreadsheet full of them. But I guess we kind of have different camps. We have those who have been tax issues around those who have been what we class as temporary extracted, so pulled out of assignment back to Australia. And then we have the Australian Tax Office, or the ATO, considerations around that. One thing that we found interesting around that was that certainly from the Australian Tax Department perspective, they were running to keep up with the speed of the pandemic. Initially, they took some concessions that they rolled out for 3 months. And then they realised, like the rest of us, this wasn't going to be over in 3 months. And then they rolled it out a little bit longer. And then they just took a hard line and said, too bad, so sad. So there's that cohort and looking after people back in Australia, but then there's the displaced cohort, which I think Lynn was referring to, and the employer and the employee considerations, permanent establishment, employer obligations. When you don't have an entity set up, and Surrey doesn't have a lot of entities offshore, how you deal with that, you really have to literally deep dive into each of those cases, which is horrendously time consuming. As a mobility professional, you have to engage with external tax advisors, which often means a lot of spend around professional fees. And so I kind of liken it to telling people that Santa isn't real anymore when I'm going around and treating these cases. Because the look on their face when I'm on WebEx with many of the HR business partners I work with, it literally looks like
let's
I'm
end it
telling my
right there.
6-year-old.
Santa isn't real. Okay, that's your one takeaway from the APAC panel. No, but we're
Sorry if
over.
that's
We're
a
a minute
spoiler.
over our 30-minute extra time. So I have to call it. This has been fantastic. Kay, Lynn, Karen, Stephen, you have been phenomenal. Everybody out there who participated in the comments and the questions, thank you so much. Thank you to Chuck and Brian, everybody at IM for putting on a phenomenal conference. I hope you go and check out all the other corporate relocation panels. We've got to go. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Everybody, you deserve a round of applause.
Thank you, Ben.
You too, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Thank you,
us.
Ben.